Hello everyone, I'm Escambia County Sheriff David Morgan and welcome to this segment of the ECSO News. Tonight's segment will be entirely Ask the Sheriff questions. We receive volumes sometimes of requests that come in both by telephone, over Facebook, and sometimes on our blogs. Again, asking the sheriff to address law enforcement issues in our community. When the volume gets such that we can't do it in the segment that's normally associated with Ask the Sheriff, meaning the very end of ECSO News, we will take the entire 30 minutes in order to catch up on our call volume. The episode tonight is one of those that will handle that particular problem. By the way, it's a great problem to have. Continue to ask us questions. I'm Escambia County Sheriff David Morgan, and stand by. Patrick asked a question that is very timely. It's in the news, and it has to do with carrying of a concealed weapon, personal protection and protection of those around, and specifically on church property and grounds. Patrick, I would recommend that you get a hold of us. We'll come out and teach a church security seminar for you. Our folks will pull the latest information on the statutes as they apply to carry of your concealed weapon where you can. Those laws are changing, and the reason being is not too many years ago about anyone that thought they were anyone could say you can't carry a concealed weapon here, you can't take it into a parking lot, etc. And those laws have been broadened to allow the carrying of a concealed firearm in many more places than they used to be. There are still restrictions on school property, meaning again the public school properties and sometimes daycares, etc. Public conveyances in post offices. Public conveyance, by the way, would be riding a bus or taking a cab. Again, I'm not too sure about Uber. So we tend to stray away from answering specific legal questions because we're not attorneys. But the folks that would come out and do your church security seminar will make sure that they check on the latest ruling on that. The reason why I say that is this: a lot of churches, the pastors and the board of deacons that administer the church, are making a determination that they need security at their churches, and so they're designating certain people. Sometimes they're off-duty law enforcement officers, deputies or police officers, to sit in strategic places in the church and to also, carry concealed firearms. And some churches are encouraging that. But again, my folks will come out and teach that course if your church would like. And we'll make sure that they know to get the latest on the carrying of concealed firearms, on church property. Lindsay asked, do our officers receive any training on PTSD and service dogs? The answer, Lindsay, is yes. We have training that's kind of encompassed in that called CIT training, which is crisis intervention training. Talks about everything from how to, when you observe, how to basically make an assessment as to whether or not that person possibly could be autistic, or again they may be on drugs, or it could be some sort of emotional mental disorder. Now, it's a very difficult thing because we're law enforcement officers, not mental health specialists. But yes, we do receive annual training on that, as well as the use and appropriate use of service dogs, meaning that they have to wear a certain emblem that marks them as a service dog. Today, one of the problems that we run into with service animals, and restaurants have the same issue, is someone will come in with a basset hound and I'm suffering from PTSD and this is my comfort animal, this is my service dog. And it's basically, all you have is the individual's word to go off of. So there are some parameters with that. There's, they're called a coat or a jacket that a dog will wear, and it'll say service animal. So there's ways that by law, if you mark the animal, then it's readily visible and known to people. The issue we get into is unfortunately the truthfulness of people. But no, our officers do have training in that area. Citizens ask, what would we say are the three top crimes in Escambia County? I'll kind of rope them into the generic areas where we talk about property crimes. Property crimes can be, your car's burglarized, your home is burglarized. So, we'll take it kind of in that.
Number one, sadly, as with almost every community in the United States, we'd have to put drugs at the very top. Reason being is drugs and illegal drug usage almost fuels every other crime that we see. Everyone wants to talk about, well, why is the drug usage so high and we have unemployment, et cetera. And so much of our crime is inextricably linked, meaning you can't point to one thing that is the trigger or the cause of so many other things that are a fallout of that. So drug usage has almost become passé in the last couple of generations. That's why I've told folks, I know they don't want to hear it, but the passage of recreational use of marijuana is probably just around the corner. Why? Because that's the voting bloc that's coming up. You have a couple of generations that have grown up, unlike my generation, where smoking marijuana was something everybody did. It was like sneaking out in high school and drinking beer with your buddies. Now the use of recreational marijuana is considered not to be a crime anymore, that it's just something that everyone does. And so therefore, when that group of individuals become the majority, which they're fast becoming, they will vote things into law that were unheard of in my generation. So this almost acceptance of what's referred to as aberrant behavior, meaning behaviors that not too many generations ago were unacceptable in decent society, has fueled the drug usage. And we know that marijuana is a gateway drug. I mean, you can debate this issue all you want about whether marijuana is more harmful than alcohol or vice versa. It really doesn't matter. Once you've crossed that threshold of it's okay to do this, it's kind of like shading sin. If you're willing to cross that threshold, you'll probably, take another step and another step. And then you have what's referred to as desensitization, meaning that, well, I tried this and it's okay now to try that. And so it kind of is a snowball effect, and that's where we're at today. So, the usage of drugs in our community, I tell young people that I speak to, I've never met a successful drug user. You will eventually succumb to the drug and it will overtake you. And now we have a society that doesn't see that drug usage is necessarily bad. We want to make excuses for why people use drugs. And so we're in the midst of an opioid explosion, again, which is a very debilitating type of drug that's sweeping the nation. Sadly, everybody's pointing their finger at law enforcement and asking us, what are you going to do about this? I'll be very direct with you. Not a whole lot. Not a whole lot. We're going to do our very best to fight drugs wherever they come from. But ladies and gentlemen, you're talking about a societal problem. You're wanting law enforcement to save you from yourself. It's a societal problem. We don't sell drugs in law enforcement. We don't do drug rehab in law enforcement. We don't talk about the benefits of illegal drug usage. We don't support in any way the use of illegal drugs. And so for anyone to say, well, what's law enforcement going to do to stop it? It's almost impossible when I have a society that is embracing behaviors that, again, we kind of give a nod and a wink to, that, well, it's just a phase, and so we need more drug rehab programs. You're working the wrong end of the problem. That's why I will very bluntly tell you there's not a whole lot we can do about this. Until society determines what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior for the good of the whole, meaning that unemployment stems from drug usage, domestic violence stems from drug usage, violence against children, stems from drug usage. And so until we as a community and as a nation step up and say the problem begins with our acceptance of behaviors that lead to these things, we're the only one that's really fighting this war on drugs. We don't have a community behind us. And if you say, well, why do you say that, Sheriff? How many times have you called us when you knew that a neighbor across the street or down the street was not necessarily selling drugs, but using drugs? You have given a nod and a wink to the use of illegal activity and basically told your children and all of your community that drug usage is okay. Now, how would you like for us to approach combating that? And the answer is that's an impossible task. I can't do that without a society and a community that steps up and in harness pulls in the same direction that we do. So drugs are the number one problems in our community. What comes next probably under that is property crimes. Car burglaries, home burglaries, etc., which many times are inspired and fueled by the need to get money to buy drugs or to get barter, meaning that I'll trade a flat screen TV for crack cocaine or whatever the drug that you currently want today or the one that you're using. And then last, I would say probably homicides in Escambia County. We've traditionally settled differences here in the criminal community, so let me be specific there. We, thank God, rarely have homicides that involve someone who's not engaged in some sort of criminal activity, and almost always, by the way, again, drugs. But we've always had traditionally a very high rate of homicides in Escambia County. Out of 67 counties, we always rate in the top 10. So, those are the three, drugs, I would say property crimes, and then homicides. What are we doing to combat those? The very best we can. But the bottom line always begins with the community that we serve. What is your acceptable level of behavior in our community? You set that standard, I don't.
Got some general questions that all kind of focus on this impersonation of a police officer that we recently had. We haven't put this PSA out in a long time, so this would probably be a good time to preview it again. We tell all citizens that, number one, you shouldn't be involved in a traffic stop except in extreme circumstances by an unmarked vehicle. And by that I mean someone has to be driving very erratically, creating a public nuisance and or hazards for a non-marked police vehicle to even attempt to effect a traffic stop. So that's your first clue. If someone gets behind you in a car that's unmarked and flashes their emergency gear or appears to have a flashing light in their car, that's your first clue that something's probably not quite right. So we recommend that everyone do this, and you can even do this, by the way, with a marked vehicle. We request that you slow your speed, stay at or below the posted speed limit, drive to the nearest public area, a Tom Thumb or a Circle K or a parking lot of Walmart, someplace where you can be seen and there's other people around. We also recommend that you get on your cell phone and dial 911. Call Central Dispatch. Give them your information, your vehicle, where you're at, your location and direction of travel, that there's a vehicle behind you that, again, is flashing lights that appears to be a law enforcement officer. Is there an officer at your location, and are they attempting to stop your vehicle? Again, our dispatch will tell you that very thing. You'll be able to hear them on the radio. They'll put a call out and ask, do we have any units in the following vicinity, and are you attempting to effect a traffic stop? This is for your safety. And so again, as long as you do that, and then let's say you get pulled into the parking lot, someone exits their vehicle and comes up, look for identifying information. Is it a 5-pointed star? Is it a Pensacola police badge? You can also ask for the officer's ID card. We all issue ID cards in law enforcement. And again, wait for Central Dispatch to get back in touch with you. Stay in your vehicle. You can roll the window down just enough to communicate with the officer making the stop. And this is for your safety. And all of that, by the way, is legal. That's not attempting to evade a stop. You'll not be cited for doing that. That's for a person's individual safety. When you have some question in your mind that the individual trying to stop you may not be a law enforcement officer. So again, slow your speed, stay within the posted speed limits, go to a safe area, a well-lighted area, obviously if it's at night. Call 911 Central Dispatch, let them know who you are, where you're at, that a vehicle is attempting to stop you. Ask if it's a legitimate law enforcement officer. They'll tell you that. And then again, proceed to that location and stop. And then of course, if it is a law enforcement officer, all of that checks out. We ask again that you comply then with all the requirements, or requests I should say, of the law enforcement officer. And again, this is for your safety.
We have a question from one of our followers as to what is the difference between an Escambia County deputy and a Pensacola police officer. Well, the main difference is in jurisdictions. Both officers, whether they're with the PPD or the Escambia County Sheriff's Office, all meet the same kind of service criteria, meaning they must complete an approved academy, they must pass the Florida Department of Law Enforcement test for certification to be a law enforcement officer in the state of Florida, and then you hire in with a respective agency. So those qualifications are equivalent across the board. The issue is jurisdiction, which is a large one, by the way. Most folks don't know that there is no statutory requirement to have a police department in any place in Florida, meaning that conceivably the mayor and the city council could meet tonight and say, we can no longer afford to have a police department, and they could literally disband the Pensacola Police Department. Now, that's an example in the extreme, but that's entirely possible, and it could be done here locally. No one can do that with the sheriff or the office of sheriff. Why? Because we're what's referred to as a constitutional office, meaning that we're in the Florida Constitution and we're governed by the statutes that you must have a sheriff in each county within the state of Florida, and there's 67. So now we get to the jurisdiction issues. My jurisdiction is the sheriff of Escambia County, and all the deputies that act in my behalf, they are in essence sheriffs because I swear them in as deputy sheriffs. Our jurisdiction is everywhere, within the city limits of Pensacola to the farthest reaches of up in Century. Any place you want to go in the county, our officers can enforce the statutes and the ordinances and the laws, if you will, of the state of Florida and Escambia County specifically. It is not so, I repeat, it is not so with members of the Pensacola Police Department. They have jurisdiction only to the city limits or where they're specifically addressed to. Like they also run the airport police. Those are members of the Pensacola Police Department. But their jurisdiction ends at the city limits. So in order for them to enforce the laws outside of that jurisdiction, it has to be under certain exigent circumstances. A hot pursuit is the one that people usually describe the most, meaning that if a crime occurs in the city, an officer is in hot pursuit of a suspect who is leaving the city limits, they have the statutory authority to, again, follow that individual and go on and enforce or enact an arrest in that situation. Otherwise, they have to stop at the city limits, come to the Escambia County Sheriff, and working through the courts and the state attorney's office will obtain the appropriate warrants. And we serve warrants, again, throughout the county, anywhere in the city or the county. So there's a huge difference there. We're also charged with court security within the courtroom, meaning all the bailiffs are sworn officers from the Escambia County Sheriff's Office. As a matter of fact, the Florida statutes clearly designate me as the elected sheriff is also the executive officer of the court system in the First Judicial Circuit. So we again have some very definitive differences between a sheriff's office and a Pensacola Police Department. Hopefully that explains the primary difference, and it's one of jurisdiction. Our jurisdictions everywhere in the county. Again, and to make it short synopsis of this, the Pensacola Police Department ends at the city limits of Pensacola. Nicole asked, how does she tell the difference between something that is real or something that is a scam? Pretty broad question, Nicole, but I'll fall back on some great old sayings. Number one, let the buyer beware, meaning that you should look at any offer with a little bit of what used to be referred to as a jaundiced eye, meaning I'm going to do a real hard focus on this thing because things are not real clear. And that's a rule that you should use, especially if it comes over a telephone or if you get these offers over your computer system. Con men are very charming and very believable. And they can, the old joke that they can sell a refrigerator to an Eskimo is a true statement. So what you do is a little bit of independent research. The Better Business Bureau is a good clearinghouse for this. Sometimes the Chamber of Commerce is. One of the good things about online systems is you can also look up, what have consumers reported back on a particular product. But a general rule is if it's an unsolicited, offer for something, please be very careful. It probably is a scam in many instances, and you need to do a little bit of independent research. We don't keep a log of that. However, we unfortunately do, because that's the purview of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, by the way. We refer almost all of those cases to a different agency for investigation because so many of them are international. Sadly, we get a lot of our internet and telephone cons that come out of Canada. And so now we have to cross not only state jurisdictional lines, but international jurisdiction lines in going to another country. And so a case that where a consumer may have been conned out of a few $100s or $1,000, now we can end up spending tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in an attempt to find the perpetrator and to effect a prosecution. So as you can well imagine, most of those, unfortunately, go unpunished. And so it's incumbent upon us as citizens and consumers to practice a little foresight and make sure that we don't become a victim of a crime. It's not hard to sell someone something that they want. And so if you think that this is a great deal and I've been wanting this, etc., again, sit down, have a cup of coffee, take a couple of deep breaths, do a little bit of due diligence, and again, practice what we preach, and that is don't be a victim of a crime.
Stephanie asked, when we put out information, especially on a lost child, the child's name, height, weight, what they were wearing last known location, etc., why we don't in law enforcement kind of close the loop, meaning now the child has been found. We do put obviously that information out, and we recall any BOLOs and those sorts of things, and depending upon how far out we put the information, in extreme cases we'll call the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Class Kids Foundation. I mean, we can gin up pretty quick to look for lost children, especially if we were worried about possible mayhem being involved. But Stephanie wants to know, at the end of all of that, why don't we get back on the air, if you will, or through the media, and give more detailed information on the child was found and the circumstances and that sort of thing. Well, Stephanie, all of that information is obviously included in the final police report, but due to privacy information, or I should say aspects of a case, the family many times, we withhold that information, although it's still a matter of public record. We don't spend that inordinate amount of time describing, again, the conclusion of the case. Why? Because the case was successful. So if you're interested in those, again, it's a matter of public record, except for those things that a family might want to, withhold, meaning their address and that sort of thing. You can request that information, but because of time constraints and privacy, we tend to not do that very thing. And you'll notice that also the media does the same thing. They'll report that the child was located and or found and returned to their parents safely, and that's pretty much the end of the story. Anthony asked the questions about what do you go through, or the steps that you have to go through to become a deputy or a law enforcement officer. Well, Anthony, you can go online, go to escambiaso.com, and there's an employment section there in one of the drop-down boxes, and you can pull that down and it'll step you through the entire process. It'll tell you the age requirements, the background investigation, polygraph, that sort of thing. All the steps that you'll have to go through and successfully complete to get hired at the Escambia County Sheriff's Office. Of course, that also applies to, again, completion of the Police Academy, which is taught through the public education system out at George Stone. That's an academy that you have to go through. Classes are conducted at night. Sometimes we commission a day class, to kind of shorten the time in its 8 hours. We also have programs where we will actually pay for your law enforcement academy. So go to escambiaso.com, pull it down. Some of that criteria changes on occasion, so we try to keep that updated. But thank you for your interest in becoming a law enforcement officer. The question is, why do we publicize or have on our website our computer-assisted dispatch calls? That was at the request of our community, and it's also part of our desire to be transparent with our community as to where our officers are working, and by that I mean calls they're responding to. There is a delay of several minutes, so again, our officers are not rolling into a situation that could be dangerous. We're always very cognizant of that, meaning false calls to where, and unfortunately in our nation, ambushing law enforcement officers is becoming a little more too common. So there may come a time where we don't show those anymore for that particular reason. Officer safety is always at the top of the list. But there is a delay, and again, there are things that are excluded from that. Sexual assaults, incidents involving juveniles, you'll not find a lot of specific information on those particular dispatches, and of course that's for privacy reasons and also legal reasons. Citizen asked a question about there's a vehicle on their property that they've asked the owner repeatedly to remove, and do they now have the legal means, if you will, or can they use legal means to have the vehicle removed? The answer to that question is yes. If you have a vehicle on your property and you've notified the owner to have the vehicle removed and they fail to do that, you can call a tow truck company and they will come and remove that vehicle and notify the owner of where it's basically been impounded. I would also ask, is the vehicle not workable, because then it comes along, that involves abandoned property and all sorts of things. But the short answer is yes, no one has a right to park a vehicle on your property and basically abandon it.
Megan asked about the use of stun guns. They're sold at flea markets, and is it legal to carry them? Megan, that the stun guns, as long as they don't shoot a projectile, come under the CWL, which is a concealed weapons license laws in Florida. I would recommend again that you get with the state attorney's office. There is a size of the, believe it or not, of the stun gun that you can carry. They're normally the handheld. They're about the size of a pack of cigarettes. But again, I don't dispense legal advice, meaning that again, you now rush out to the flea market and buy a stun gun, and then you get arrested for carrying something not in compliance. I don't stay up current with those laws, so we'll do a search and ask our legal department, has that changed before we actually will formally charge someone. So again, I would recommend you get a hold of the state attorney's office and ask them what the current rulings are on private citizens and the carry of stun guns with or without a concealed weapons license. I know with the CWL, you're allowed to carry a whole host of different weapons for your personal defense, and you should also ask them that question.
We still get citizens' calls about Amber Alerts and how those are generated and what is the criteria. Folks, to kind of give you a short answer and expect to see this clip played more than once, we don't control the Amber Alerts and the criteria and who makes a determination on whether an Amber Alert is issued or not. That goes through the Attorney General's office and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. So I would direct you to those websites and look up the criteria for how is an Amber Alert assembled and a determination made to issue an Amber Alert in any given instance.
Remember, you can also email your questions and ask the sheriff at escambiaso.com. We'll be back next week right here on Blab TV Tuesday night at 8 p.m.